Good morning, everyone, dear Minister, ambassadors, audience, and to all the Nordics sitting here listening and watching what is happening here in Oslo today. We are here to celebrate the 23rd of March, which is the Day of the Nordics. And to be honest, I felt this morning that this is a day now which feels much more important than it has ever been. But we'll also talk about what's happened in the Nordics during the pandemics, and we will hear from a new research from Nordic on how the countries could and could not communicate with each other during the two last heavy years. I will give you a quote before I will hand over the floor to the Minister of Co-cooperation, Anne Beate Tvinnereim. But here, listen to this. And this is from another report from a Finnish Institute of International Affairs, also looking into the Nordic cooperation through the last 2 years. If we are not collaborating between ourselves here in the Nordic region, who is going to listen to us? If we cannot unite around values, trust, development, open-mindedness, and our welfare model, if we don't spend time unnecessary on this to the Nordic region, we won't have the strength to stand against dark clouds in the horizon. That's a backdrop for today. Please, Anne Beate Tvinnereim, your floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hilde, and good morning, everyone, and congratulations. Today we celebrate the Nordic Day, and on this very day, we mark the 60th anniversary of the Helsinki Treaty. And this treaty, along with the many Nordic institutions, have helped shape the Nordic region and the Nordic identity as we know it today. Now, right now, we are in the midst of an illegal, full-scale war in the midst of Europe. And the scope of the tragedy is being played out, and it's difficult to fathom. More than 3 million Ukrainians have left their countries. Many more are internally displaced. According to the UN, a total of 10 million people have fled their homes. We don't know how this will end. What we can do, however, is to examine how the last crisis have impacted us as we prepare for the next. And myself and many of my colleagues here today come straight from Malmö and a session in the Nordic Council where this was lively discussed based on our strong common values. Policy should always be knowledge-driven, and the report that we get presented here today helps us explore how the pandemic impacted Nordic countries, regions, and municipalities. The coronavirus pandemic impacted all sectors of economy, all aspects of society, and the virus shook our labor market, our economy, health, and the strict entry restrictions entailed major challenges for employees, companies, students, pupils, many, many more. This put the people in the Nordic countries, especially in the bordering regions, to a demanding test, which we are still lively discussing in the Nordic context. So let us just be open about this. Sweden and Norway had different policies on entry restrictions, which caused reactions from the Swedish side. This led to the need for some fence mending. But let me emphasize, we have very close contact. I am absolutely confident that the Norwegian-Swedish relations are strong, will remain strong. But we should learn from what happened. Despite the many negative consequences of the pandemic, one of the key takeaways of this report is that the Nordic region has shown economic resilience during the crisis. the economic repercussions of the pandemic have been less severe in the Nordic countries than in other European countries. Industries, sectors, and individuals have shown remarkable adaptability in the shift towards remote work, for example. And this change was made easier in the Nordic countries due to a growing trend of remote working that preceded the pandemic, especially when it comes to knowledge and IT-sensitive sectors. And those strengths were used to adapt to the new realities. The Nordic region has governmental structures that enable us to collaborate on different levels, and this report demonstrates the importance of such collaboration for the transition towards sustainability, which is our vision for 2030, to become the most sustainable region globally. This report, this is in terms of not only climate, also economic stability and sustainability. Nordic cooperation and partnership will, I am confident, help us navigate current crisis and future crisis. And I look forward to our discussion today and to celebrate Nordic Day with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those words, Anne Beate. Now we are in the midst of what we're going to discuss the rest of this morning. I will have on stage here Gustav Norlén from Nordic. He will present this report that we've heard about now. Nordic is an international research center for regional development and planning. So welcome, Gustav, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today presenting this new report, and maybe you will see it soon as well on the screen. So I'm Gustav Norlén, I'm the project manager for the report, which is about regional development. And it's a series that has been since the 1981. I realized yesterday that I've probably been taking part of all of this series from being part of the birth statistics in the first edition in 1981 to today. And the focus of the report is regional development focusing on demography, labor market, and economy. And for this year, quite early on in the process, it was quite clear to us that it would be the effects of COVID-19 that would be in the focus of this report, and how it affected the regional development in the demography, labor market, and economy. And I will only make a short summary, but it's more that you can find in the report, so I just wanted to make that clear, that you can find the report online from today. So now I will just quickly say something about the effect on demography, labor market, and economy, and then some emerging trends, and then some conclusions. So first, starting with the effects on demography, it's a quite clear connection to the pandemic and the demography, since it affects the health and in the end also the number of deaths. I think we have more than 25,000 deaths in COVID by now, which is quite substantial. Still, if you compare this to, first you can say that if you look at this map, Sweden is an outlier in the Nordic region when it comes to excess mortality and life expectancy, as this map shows. I think that's no surprise to you. And this was especially in the first year of the pandemic in 2020. But if you look at this indicator from a European perspective, it's quite clear that it's the other Nordic countries that stand out rather. So you see the blue ones on the map are the Nordic countries except Sweden, and they are the ones that had an increased life expectancy during the pandemic. And it's quite remarkable because the life expectancy is an indicator that usually goes up and up and up, but here we see a decline in almost all of Europe. Also, when you look at the other side of the demography, the babies, you could see that the Nordic region stands out also here with an increased number of births, especially in Finland, Norway, and Iceland. They had the highest increase in the number of births from quite low levels, you should say, at least in Finland and Norway. But still, they also stand out here if you compare to the rest of Europe, where especially the southern part of Europe had a steep decline in number of births. Moving on to the labor market, also there, of course, the effects have been quite strong, and I think maybe you have all been affected by working from home, for example, one thing that has happened. I like ILO and the OECD and these international institutions because they have a bit stronger descriptions of things, and the ILO describes the effects on the labor market as deep, far-reaching, and unprecedented. And of course, this is true, especially for the first part of the pandemic, when I think 70% of the world's population lived in countries with strict lockdowns or strong restrictions on mobility, and up to 90% if you include the ones with recommendations of decreased mobility. And this, of course, affected the demand and supply in the economy. And if you look on the decrease in the mobility, we have looked at the Google mobility data. Google knows where we work and where we live, so they can follow this over time. And you can see then that there has been, in the beginning of the pandemic, it was, I can show you this graph. So this shows the whole pandemic until 2022, and the decrease in the mobility to work, so the work travels. And I think you can say three things from that. That first, you can see in the first circle there that in the beginning of the pandemic, this is March, April 2020, the decrease in work travels was 45% in the other Nordic countries, but in Sweden it was around 30%. So you see the different measures in the beginning, but after that it was quite remarkable similarities in the mobility, and I highlighted the last part there. It was after the restrictions were taken off in October last year, and you can still see that still it was a decrease in the work travel, indicating maybe that more people work from home. And of course, this work mobility decrease was also because of unemployment and these furlough measures, permittering in Swedish and Norwegian, I think. And in the labor market context, it was also clear that there was some sectors that were more impacted. Of course, these sectors in tourism, accommodations, and food services, and these that need close proximity, physical proximity, and mobility. Whereas in other sectors, like in information, communication, and I think in some public sector jobs, the employment actually increased during the pandemic. And then, the last thing, of course, we had the furlough measures mitigating the effects of on the labor market. If you compare, for example, to the US, the unemployment increased quite steep and then declined also quite more rapidly. But in the Nordic region, we had this furlough system, and I think in April, around 10%, almost 10% was on these furlough measures, especially then in sectors affected by the changes in the demand and supply. And this is what this map shows. It shows the furlough as a share of the total employed in May 2020. And the impact on the economy, of course, is connected to the labor market. And as mentioned, the GDP in the Nordic region decreased. It decreased in 2020 by 3%, but this is lower than the EU average. That was 6%. And also here, you can see the regional differences, where the largest GDP decrease was in regions and countries that have a lot of, for example, tourism, such as Iceland, that had a 7% decrease, and also Åland, you could say, strong affected. And then also the economic support measures were, of course, mitigating the impact on the economy. And the Nordic region countries, they spent quite significant money on these support measures. I think in Denmark it was more than 30% of the GDP In Norway and Sweden, around 15%. And all of this is higher than the EU average, which was around 10% of the GDP. But if you look at these two graphs, the first one above there is the COVID-19 pandemic, and the lower one is what OECD, with its greater words, call the Great Recession, so the financial crisis, we would call it. And you can see in the COVID, it's more of a V-shaped recovery, quite clear, rather than what I think OECD called the L-shaped recovery in the financial crisis, although I'm not sure if you see an L there, or a U, or whatever you would see. And then, just mentioning these new trends, or as mentioned also, they were quite high already before the pandemic in the Nordic region, this with the remote working, but it definitely accelerated. I think most of you probably worked from home. But still, there is quite bad data on this, on how many work from home. Sweden, they extended their labor force survey to follow up by month, and in the first quarter of 2021, 42% of the employed in Sweden worked remotely, at least part-time. But here you see also the big differences between the regions. It was more than double as many in Stockholm than in Dalarna, for example, in Sweden. And this reflects, of course, the occupation structure and the sectors in the different regions, where some regions have more jobs that you can work from home in this more information sectors. And this map shows, since there's not so much actual data, this shows the remote work potential, so the number of jobs that theoretically can be made from home, based on a study from two American researchers. And it has quite good correlation with the Swedish labor force survey data, and it shows that it's mainly in the cities. The purple municipalities here are the ones above the Nordic average, and as you can see, it's quite few, and they are mainly in the cities. So you can then ask, will this be a long-term trend, and will it then change the settlement patterns that you will move out from the cities or not? We've seen some early signs during 2020, 2021. Of course, it's a bit too early to say, but during 2020, the immigration, of course, fell to the lowest level since 2005. But at the same time, the internal migration increased, and it was the highest, I think, in Norway, the highest in 6 decades, and similar in the other Nordic countries. So people moved, and they moved away from the capital cities. And this was a trend already before COVID, but it's even more accelerated here. And if you compare these two maps, the right one is 2020, and the left one is 2010 to 2018 average. And you can see, first of all, there is more blue regions in the right map, meaning more regions had and municipalities had net in-migration. And I also try to highlight, I don't know if you see the ones with the highest in-migration, it's mainly around the bigger urban areas, so in the outskirts of the labor market regions, for example, of Stockholm, Oslo, Copenhagen, and Helsinki. But also some that you could say attractive rural areas, like Åre, for example, in Sweden, is the one that have had the highest in-migration during these years. So we can see if that trend continues. And I'm just going to end with some conclusions and learnings that we have had from the publication. I mentioned the strength of the economic resilience that mitigated the economic impact, and that was part because we have strong economies. We could make all this. We could take loans, and we could start these measures to decrease the impact. Also, the demographic stability, a strong healthcare, and contributed to less deaths than in the rest of the EU. Also, probably our generous welfare systems and the parental leave system encourage people to still have babies, even if it's a crisis. So show the demographic stability and the flexible and adaptive labor market. We could quickly adapt to working from home in a quite remarkable way. And decreased emissions. We had decreased emissions, at least during 2020. It would be an opportunity to continue that path for the green transition, but it looks like the emissions now are increasing again. And then this new migration patterns, could it mean that the rural areas will be revitalized? It's a question mark behind that. But also then some challenges. We could see the socioeconomic inequalities clear, both in the fact of who was mainly impacted by the virus, being the elderly and socioeconomic weak groups especially, but also in the labor market that these groups were more hardly hit. The decreased tourism affected some regions quite hardly. And then the decreased mobility within the Nordic region, of course, we've got used to now 65 years since the Nordic Passport Union. We've been used to having free mobility across the borders, and of course this has been a big blow, not only for the 49,000 or 50,000 cross-border commuters, but also people having a summer house in other countries and so forth. And also, you could see an impact on the trust and the social capital during this responses to the pandemic that have been more state-centered. And I will end there.
Thank you very much. You can just stay on stage, I guess, Gustav, because I will now call for the panelists to come up here. We've already seen the minister, and she can come back. Gustav Norlén, you can be there. Rasmus Jungersen Emborg, president of the Nordic Youth Council, and Helge Orten, vice chair of the Norwegian delegation of the Nordic Council. And I think I will move over here. Thank you very much for your presentation, Gustav. I want to start actually with the youth in the room. I will start with you, Rasmus. You have also read this report and the conclusions, and what's your first remarks on it?
I think that the report really shows that socioeconomic split that has also been mentioned. One thing that I think it's a brilliant report. One thing that I really thought about was that just last week there was a new report in Denmark about the mental health of young people. And I think many of us have had this concern, what would happen during the COVID crisis for young people as well. Because if you imagine this, that if we're speaking of border obstacles, a lot of young people, also people that I know, were about to start a new semester over the Sund. They were maybe going to study in Sweden. And then what happens? Their stay is cancelled. They can't go back to their own university because the two of them don't coordinate together. They lose their income that they would get from student grants. They might be without job. You're already at a point in your life where you might have debt, or you have a low income and you don't have savings. That's rough. And just last week, we've seen that now every second young woman in Denmark is stressed. 1 out of 3 young women have bad mental health, if they ask themselves. And for men, it's every 5th man. This is alarming. If we're speaking about trust in the system, then this is definitely something, a challenge that we share within all the Nordics. Because we're having a society in which you have Instagram, TikTok, you have these individualized technological platforms where you have targeted ads for young girls that are just 14, 15 years old. They shouldn't even be there on the platform for surgery, for makeup, for what they can do to look prettier. We have machines, in this case, your phone that's built literally to hack your mind so that you spend more time on it.
And this was, of course, during the pandemics, the digital measure. I mean, that's what we did. We were there. And what I've been thinking about as well is that even though we now see that we were kind of resilient as well, because we could deal with certain things in a better way than the rest of Europe, the rest of the world. And even in Norway, more babies and Sweden, everywhere, and more babies popping out. So something must have been okay-ish. But then I also wonder sometimes whether this feeling of being sacrificed as a generation has grown on the young generations that actually did the work. For, to be honest, also this pandemic was attacking, first and foremost, the elderly and the older generation, which I think a lot of the youngsters felt there was a good reason to be home, because you want to protect your grandfathers and mothers. Do you think there is a certain feeling of being sacrificed?
Definitely. In the start of the pandemic, our Prime Minister said, "You that have your lives ahead of you are taking care of those with their lives behind of them." You're showing a consideration for society that's saving lives. Young people lost more than just parties and the ability to hang out with people, which was a lot in the media, but we literally lost what should have been the contact network for the rest of our lives. Many of us were set behind. And I think we should reconsider or use this as a way to reflect over the society that we're in. Like, for instance, in the educational system, it's different across all the Nordics, but still we're seeing the same trend. And are we there in a situation where we're weighing characters in school over character as a person, for instance? Should we put more emphasis for young people being a part of a larger community, a community that expects something from you, where you meet people that you haven't chosen? I think it's this unity in the Nordic region and in the Nordics that could be one of the answers towards the mental health crisis.
Yeah, and now, Helge, I will move on to you, because you sit there in the Nordic Council, and we're talking in here about, of course, solutions. Where do we go from here, as is one of the questions that were raised before this meeting. And of course, getting the youngsters on board is very crucial. How do you think the Nordics can cooperate on bringing this issue in?
I think it's very important, as Rasmus points out, that one of the most serious post-pandemic issues are actually the welfare of the younger people, because they suffered through this crisis by social distancing and all the loneliness, perhaps, and other mental problems, whatever. And the problem with any crisis is that, and especially this type of pandemic, is that if you have a problem before you enter the crisis, you have an even bigger problem when you're trying to get out of the crisis. And I think this is something that will put our welfare systems really on test. Are we able to actually meet these people, find these people, and help these people in a serious and good way? And I think the Nordic Council can be an arena for discussing these issues, putting it on top of the agenda, but also each individual country has to actually so put emphasis on it and actually work with our own systems, with our own welfare systems, to be able to meet this in a good way. Because I have two children being students the last couple of years myself, and I see that their time as a student has been very different from mine, and it does something with people.
But is it enough on the agenda? Has this been discussed in the forums where you are?
I think this is the report also makes a good foundation for a further discussion on it. And I'm sure we will discuss this further in the Nordic Council as well, and also in our own parliaments, because this should be on top of the agenda in the near future. And then on top of that, I mean, entering out of a post-pandemic or getting into a post-pandemic situation, try to deal with all the post-pandemic issues. we get a war in Europe as well, which also we'll have a lot of refugees coming to our countries. We have to handle that as well. And I think it's a terrible situation, and it's it's a terrible situation in Ukraine, and we should help in all possible ways. But at the same time, it also emphasizes the value of international cooperation. We see that the EU strengthens, we see the defense alliance, NATO strengthens, and I think the Nordic cooperation will strengthen as well because of the situation in Europe. And I think that actually will help us in a way in dealing with these type of matters. International solidarity, I think it will be higher on the agenda in the future or in the near future due to the crisis we see, pandemic, war in Europe, etc.
Anne-Beate Tvinnereim, you also had a very serious note from the beginning here, and when you now listen to Rasmus, do you think that that the politicians and the health authorities were enough aware of or took into consideration that this would hit on a specific generation?
No, I think that was a wake-up call as we went along. And I agree with Rasmus. I think we still haven't really taken it fully into account. Although I must, you asked if this was a discussion in the Nordic Council. The three of us met in Malmö yesterday, and I'm very pleased with how the Nordic Council manages to give a voice to the Youth Council, to Rasmus here, which really plays a role in the Nordic discussions, which is absolutely crucial. And of course, for the future, it's important that the Nordic spirit continues along the generations, and that means that new generations need to trust the Nordic system, the Nordic institutions, the Nordic spirit, and also, just to be inspired to learn Nordic languages. I mean, we are all familiar with how English comes into account more often. We sit here speaking English. That's there's another reason for that. But that's because I truly believe that the Nordic cooperation is such a strength and such an important factor in our global competitiveness. And that means we have to guard it. And I, as a Minister of Nordic Cooperation, I'm truly worried about some of the aspects, especially on the lost trust or decreased trust after the pandemic, especially in bordering regions. We have taken for granted the free mobility for 65 years. And I think most of the inhabitants in the Nordic countries, they took it for granted. They didn't realize that it could be shut down. The borders could be shut down from one day to the other. And this is, hopefully the pandemic or the worst of the pandemic is behind us, but border crossing, border control is an issue that we discussed today with the new crisis that unfold in Europe. So we really have to take that. We have to learn from the pandemic in terms of avoiding shutting down the borders in future crises, because it has a huge impact on the Nordic trust and the Nordic our strengths.
Before I go to Helge again, I just have to ask you, because I mean, we talk about the border communities, they were very much affected, but still the tone between it was between Sweden, Norway, and Finland and Sweden, and Denmark and Sweden, huge debates and debacles, you almost say. And then the foreign minister of Sweden, when she went out, she said that this is back to the war, the tone between the countries. Of course, it has eased up a bit, but how has Norway worked on the relationship with Sweden again?
Well, first of all, the tone is very good today. We have a close dialogue, and we all accept that the national authorities were in charge of the national measures, and this was a health crisis, and this was the way we had to do it. But the thing was that measures were taken on very, very short notice. And what we discuss a lot in the Ministerial Council is that we need to improve the communication before decisions and measures are taken, and have a good analysis of the consequences on a local level. Because, you know, no one did this out of... no one wanted the negative effects to happen, but things happen very quickly. And I think that especially in the bordering regions, Svinesund, Öresund, Haparanda, the consequences on an individual level, you know, for that individual family worker that crosses the border every day, that was not sufficiently taken into account. We have to learn from that.
Helge, and then I will bring in Gustav here.
Yeah, I think these border issues are very important, and I think the pandemic has revealed that the Nordic region is not perfect in that respect, not yet.
The most integrated region in the world.
Yes, that's the goal,
supposedly.
and that's what we're aiming at. And I think that's why I think the pandemic has shown us that there are still some barriers, and we have to work on that seriously. Because I came into the Norwegian Council this autumn because after the election, and what really has been an awakening for me is to listen to the people living at the border.
Yeah.
Because they are really suffering, because they are working across the border. The border is not an issue really for these people. Therefore, it's very important that we try to make the border as not being a barrier for working across the border. And I think there are a lot of issues. We have discussed that. We have our own group in the Norwegian Council working with the border barriers. And I think you had to actually use the momentum we have now to actually do something about it, because this can be a really good and integrated region. It is a good region for that sake, but you know, it could be better. And we have to learn by what we see now as being barriers to a good cooperation across border. And we are actually depending on people from Sweden, from Norway, from Denmark, Finland, etc., working seamlessly, you know, in the Nordic region, because we need the workforce.
I know that the next session for people following this will be from Stockholm. Will be going into depth about this issue. Gustav, I just want to ask you, when you listen to this conversation, and we started with the youngsters and going to the borders, it's all about trust. What's your suggestions? You have a few suggestions in the report, of course, but where do we go from here?
That's a very good question. Well, cooperation, I guess, would be the main suggestion, to cooperate more. And of course, the next crisis will be something else. We see the new crisis coming up here.
There is a crisis now.
There is a crisis now, and cooperation will be even more important. But maybe you have to be aware that there will be crises, and how will that affect the Nordic cooperation?
Rasmus.
I think we have to use the two crises that we're seeing now as a driver for further Nordic integration. There's so much we can do if we, as the Nordic countries, are together as a strong democratic voice in the world as well. And for instance, in the Enestam report that was written about what happened during the crisis, one of the things that he mentions is the culture and education as well. For me personally, I've been to both Sweden, I've been to Helsinki during exchanges. There are so many young people right now, we don't know Scandinavian languages. Even in the Youth Nordic Council, there's a lot of our members that can't speak Scandinavian at all. And two ways of creating stronger bonds in terms of the whole cultural approach is education. So for instance, why don't we have an application platform where you can search for higher education in the Nordics? Why don't we have easier access to the public service and the different channels? Like our parents, they used to see Swedish TV on Norwegian TV. We don't do that anymore. So there's some of these things we can work with. For instance, why isn't it the norm that we have sister schools in the other Nordic countries? Why isn't that normal that at one point during during your education, you go either to Norway, you go to Iceland, you go to Greenland maybe, and you actually have an exchange. Like it's these bonds.
And then it doesn't help that Nordic Council, I think the culture budget was cut by 25% the last period. Perhaps that is something to restore, get back. But I mean the civil defense that is in the cultural knowledge about each other is also very important. I have read in reports. But Anne-Beate, you had your hand up.
In terms of culture and education, that is the bread and butter of our corporation, and you know the Ministerial Council's budget is 1 billion crowns, and a majority goes to the bread and butter. So you know that is the strong components, but we will discuss the money. But I wanted to say, because I felt that my last remark was a little bit on the negative note, and I guess that's the thing. As a politician, you always want to pinpoint where you can improve and make improvements. But today is a day of celebration. It's the Nordic Day, and just the report shows what fantastic resilience we have built in the Nordic community due to these strengths we have, due to the trust, due to the welfare systems that really enable us to meet new crises as well. Now all Nordic countries are receiving refugees from the Ukraine. We have the welfare states to take on that job, so we really need to remind ourselves that we have a lot to be proud of as well.
Yes.
Yeah, you had,
Since following up all the positive words, we actually live in a fantastic part of the world, and it's in the Nordic region. It's a lot of opportunities.
I have to say that
it's a politician. We're celebrating Nordic Day today. So.
I have to then admit that I looked into the world happiness. Who's the most happy? The Finns are the most happy, then the Danish. And then Iceland is there, and Sweden is there, and we are number 8, so we have to work on being more happy, I guess.
Making children, at least.
We are very unhappy, and we make children. But you can have. We are getting close to closing up before moving on to Stockholm. But you had your hand up.
Yeah, just imagine if, for instance, we pooled the Nordic resources together, if the Nordic region was actually there as a whole, we would be the 10th or 11th largest economy in the world. We have the best welfare system, best social system. We're world leading in green solutions. What a driving force for good and democracy and human rights we could be in the world. I think here on Nordic Day, this is one of the best opportunities to see this as a call for further Nordic integration. The Nordic cooperation was born after the Second World War as a way for the Nordics to make sure that we would also have good societies in the future. Now we've seen 2 world-spanning crises. Shouldn't this, if anything, be a call for further Nordic integration? I think so.
And I think, to be honest, that even we have 1 minute left, I think we should end on that note. Thank you very, very much to this panel. And for people watching, listening in, there will be more this day to celebrate. So thank you so much.
Thank you.